All right, an update on those documents that were taken from Donald Trump's Florida home a little more than 3 weeks ago. You might recall that Judge Aileen Cannon, who is still weighing the possibility of having a special master sort of go through those documents. Well, that special master, if true, is going to have a lot of work on his or her hands. We're getting word right now, since the judge has approved a detailed inventory from that search, to reveal better than 11,000 documents were retrieved in all. Now, most were not classified one way or the other, but more than 100 were classified documents. Furthermore, there were about 90 empty boxes, 48 of which were labeled classified material, which means they're empty now. Where is that material? We don't know much more than that, but there is a sense that this is much more involved and much more sweeping than we earlier figured. Let's get the read on all of this right now from Carl Szabo. Carl is the Vice President General Counsel for NetJoyce, a professor of Internet Law at George Mason University Scalia Law School. Carl, a lot we don't know. For example, we don't know what those documents are about. We know there are a lot of them, but the 11,000 plus figure, that's a lot. What do you make of that?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This is really scary. I mean, the special master is going to come in, sit down, figure out what's relevant and what's irrelevant, and make sure that the protected information, like President Trump's conversations with his lawyers, maybe research, that stays confidential, that stays protective, and what doesn't. But what really is scary is how we are seeing kind of this unchecked, unprecedented invasion of and raid of a former president's home. But the good news is that we were able to use new features like social media to begin holding this administration to account in ways that legacy newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post would never report. One of the things that we've seen come out of this because of social media is within moments of the raid, President Trump was able to alert everyone, his supporters, his followers, and the news media as to what was happening, and then they were able to lead and get involved in the story and identify what was going on. Now, this also gets into the really scary conversation of what this administration is trying to do to seize control of that accountability mechanism, the social media platform, with actions like its Disinformation Oversight Governance Board led by Mary Poppins, and to really stop people like from President Trump and other defendants from telling their story and getting it out there before the White House can spin the narrative.
Well, who really cares who spins the narrative, right? I mean, if the argument among Donald Trump and his team in the beginning is we don't have any documents, and then to grudging them that, well, we did have some documents, and then to say, all right, we've given you all the documents we had, and it turns out that they didn't give all the documents they had, hence prompting presumably this raid on his home. And now we learned that there were a lot more documents there than we thought. There's a lot to unpack there. What do you think?
Yeah, there is a lot to unpack. And what often goes on in these conversations, I've been involved in discovery in my legal career as well, is oftentimes one side, in this case the prosecution, says, you've got more docs. And then the defendant says, no, we don't. And the prosecution yells more and the defendants yell more. And it often ends up with a settlement. And that's what we saw going forward throughout much of this discussion, where the FBI and the archives were saying there were more documents and the Trump administration was working with them. Then you saw the unprecedented step to kick in the door and raid a house, raid a home. And the question is, what other documents were there? And that's what's really been really scary about this whole thing.
So if the government wanted to pursue, I'm sorry, just to be clear, if the government wanted to pursue a criminal case, I understand, and you're the expert lawyer, but I understand that it wouldn't be based on just the sheer argument that it has documents it shouldn't have had. And because you can go back and forth on whether they're declassified or not. And remember, at first, President Trump said he didn't have any documents there at all. Leaving that aside, it's the obstruction part that the government wants to prove. The time and again, the argument had been, don't have them, we'll give you this, we don't, and back and forth. And that's what they're building a case on. It's difficult enough for a normal person when you're doing that to go after a normal citizen. I would imagine it's a big leap doing so when you're targeting a former president of the United States.
Let's remember, a warrant for search of somebody's home is a constitutionally protected regime. It's very difficult to get a warrant to invade somebody's home. It's one of the most protected pieces of property that we own. And it's one of the things that separates us from a tyrannical rule. And what you saw here, and this is what makes it so much more interesting as we talk about this more on social media, we begin to hold this administration more to account, is what was known, when was known, and what was the basis for this warrant? Because we already have an FBI that's on record having created false warrants based on false information. So we really need to know as the American people what's going on. And that's where what scares me at NetChoice and what gets me up every single day is to make sure that we keep the internet free of governmental control. I mean, look, right now we've got a president out there saying the biggest threat to democracy are supporters of Trump. No, the biggest threat to democracy is an administration that doesn't respect the rule of law, the Constitution, and tries to seize control of social media as well as legacy media. And that's what we're seeing out of this administration.
So I understand what you're saying about a big threat to democracy, and I don't mean to quibble with you on there, but isn't it a pretty big threat to democracy when a former president leaves with more than 11,000 documents that he shouldn't have taken to his home?
That's the real question, because we don't know if he did or did not have the authority to take that home with him. And playing devil's advocate for the sake of it, anytime you've ever left an office, anytime you've ever left a job, you're probably going to end up accidentally taking home a pen or pencil or a pad of paper that you shouldn't have.
This isn't a pen or pencil
that
or
may
pad
be
of
what
paper.
we're talking
These
about.
are 11,000 documents and more than 100 classified. I mean, I think it's a little more than that, right?
Oh, absolutely. And there's a lot to be looked at. But the real question, I think the real consternation that a lot of people have had is, this is a big step to kick in the door. That is a big step to go and raid somebody's home, let alone a former president. Coming from an administration that is already politically motivated, coming from an FBI that has threats of political motivation. So a threat to democracy is not only taking documents that you shouldn't have taken, but undermining confidence in
I do see what you're talking about. Just to be clear, though,
and trustworthy of the system.
But then in the end, if you have all these documents, and I can see what you're saying, going too far to raid someone's home, let alone a former president, and now you have better than 11,000 documents, you can look at that and say, all right, justification there. You say?
Yeah, I mean, look, criminal activity should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, regardless of who you are, whether you're somebody who's a common person or you're the former president of the United States. But when it comes to what is potentially politically motivated activity, that's where the government must tread lightly, carefully, and do so in a way that builds Americans' trust in the system, not creates questions of politically motivated activity. And that's what we're seeing a lot of. And that's why we need to hold to account any administration, every administration, where it seems to leverage the law enforcement arms for its own political purposes. So to the extent that that's happening here, shame on any administration for abusing our law enforcement for politics. But that's why it's important that we have a reliable stream of information and the ability for the American people to say their piece, for defendants to say their piece, and for that information to get out without it being filtered through an administration that wants to seize control of the narrative.
Okay. Carl, thank you very much. Carl Szabo on all of that. We've got the Dow now down to about a 31-point gain. What's going on there after this?